In 1963, one factory in Chicago controlled 25% of every bicycle sold in America. Walk into any suburban garage that year, and you'd find one, a Schwinn, red, blue, chrome gleaming under a single bulb. The name meant something then. It meant quality. It meant American. It meant the bike your dad rode and his dad before him. For nearly 7 decades, the Schwinn Bicycle Company didn't just sell bicycles. It owned the American bicycle. But 29 years later, in October 1992, that same company stood in federal bankruptcy court with $75 million in debt it couldn't pay. The Chicago factory where workers once built 1 million bikes a year sat empty, silent. The distribution network that reached every corner of America had collapsed. The brand that defined American cycling for generations was gone. Not wounded, not struggling. Gone. This is a story of how an immigrant German bicycle maker built the most dominant manufacturing empire in American cycling history, how his family held that empire for nearly a century, and how in less than 2 decades, they lost everything. Not because the market disappeared. Not because Americans stopped riding bikes. They lost it because they stopped believing they could lose it. Because when the world changed, they refused to change with it. Because they made the same mistake every falling empire makes. They thought their name alone would save them. Welcome inside the Chicago factory, where Schwinn's dream was built, dominated, and destroyed. Chicago, 1891. A 31-year-old German immigrant named Ignaz Schwinn stepped off a train into a city that didn't know his name and didn't care. He left behind everything in the old country, a failed business, debts, the weight of starting over in his 30s. He had one skill. He knew how to build bicycles. Back in Germany, he'd worked in the shops, learned the craft of frame building, understood the mechanics of 2 wheels and a chain. But knowing how to build something and knowing how to sell to our different universes. Chicago in the 1890s was chaos. The bicycle boom was exploding. Everyone wanted one. Hundreds of manufacturers were flooding the market, most of them con artists slapping wheels onto frames and calling themselves bicycle makers. The quality was garbage. Frames cracked. Wheels collapsed. Customers bought bikes that fell apart in weeks. But they kept buying because the boom was madness, because bicycles meant freedom, because for the first time in human history, ordinary people could travel faster than a horse without needing to feed one. Ignaz saw the opportunity differently. He didn't want to be another fly-by-night manufacturer. He wanted to build bikes that lasted. That meant capital. That meant a partner. In 1895, for years after arriving in America, he found one. Adolf Arnold was a meat-packing magnate who'd made a fortune in Chicago's stockyards. He had money but no manufacturing experience. Ignaz had experience but no money. They formed Arnold, Schwinn and Company with a handshake and a small factory building at Lake Street and Peoria Street on Chicago's west side. The partnership was simple. Arnold supplied the capital. Ignaz ran the operation. They started producing what they called world bicycles, basic safety bicycles designed for the mass market. The timing couldn't have been better. The boom was still roaring. Orders poured in, but Ignaz Schwinn wasn't celebrating yet. He'd seen booms before. He knew what came next. The bicycle bubble burst. Almost overnight. Hundreds of manufacturers who'd flooded the market during the boom went bankrupt in months. The streets of Chicago were littered with abandoned factories, half-finished inventory rusting in warehouses, suppliers screaming for payment they'd never receive. Over 2,000 bicycle manufacturers operating in America in 1900 collapsed to fewer than 300 by 1905. The market didn't just cool, it imploded. Arnold, Schwinn and Company should have died with them. But Ignaz Schwinn had prepared. While his competitors chased every order, cutting costs and quality to flood the market, Schwinn had focused on building a reputation. When the crash came, customers remembered which bikes had held together and which had fallen apart. They remembered the Schwinn name. That memory bought time. But time alone doesn't pay the bills. Schwinn needed a strategy, and what he did next separated him from every other survivor. He didn't try to compete on price. He didn't chase the bottom of the market where manufacturers were slaughtering each other over pennies. Instead, he went the other direction. He focused on quality, on durability, on the idea that a Schwinn bicycle wasn't just a bicycle. It was an investment, a bike that would last 10 years instead of 2. He started offering something almost unheard of in the industry at the time, a guarantee. Buy a Schwinn, and if it breaks, Schwinn will fix it. This wasn't marketing. This was insurance. And in a market drowning in broken bikes and broken promises, it worked. Then Schwinn did something even smarter. He created a dealer network. Instead of selling through department stores and general retailers where bicycles competed with everything from shoes to canned goods, Schwinn sold through dedicated bicycle shops. Shops that would train their staff, display the bikes properly, provide after-sale service. He gave those dealers exclusive territories, protected margins, and something critically important in the chaos of post-boom bicycle retail: stability. By 1905, while the industry was still hemorrhaging companies, Arnold, Schwinn and Company was not just surviving, it was growing. Ignaz bought out Arnold's interest in 1908, renaming the company Schwinn Bicycle Company and taking sole control. The crisis that destroyed his competitors had made him stronger. Ignaz Schwinn walked into a meeting room with an idea that would define his company for the next 4 decades. Motorcycles. The internal combustion engine was changing everything. Motorcycles were the future of personal transportation, or so it seemed. Everyone was experimenting with motorized bicycles. Schwinn saw an opportunity to diversify, to enter a market that didn't collapse every time the economy hiccuped. In 1911, Schwinn acquired the Henderson Motorcycle Company and later the Excelsior Motor Manufacturing and Supply Company, becoming one of America's largest motorcycle manufacturers. For the next 20 years, Schwinn built both bicycles and motorcycles, 2 wheels powered by legs and 2 wheels powered by engines. The motorcycle business was profitable, genuinely profitable, and it kept Schwinn's name visible in ways bicycles couldn't. Racing motorcycles, speed records, the glamour of motorized power. But here's the thing most people don't know about the Schwinn motorcycle business. Ignaz never loved it. He was a bicycle man. Motorcycles were a hedge, a business decision, not a passion. And when the Great Depression hit in 1929, that hedge saved the company's life. The motorcycle business generated cash when the bicycle business was bleeding. But by 1931, even motorcycles couldn't outrun the Depression. The market for expensive motorized toys evaporated. Schwinn made a decision. They shut down the motorcycle division entirely and refocused everything on bicycles. Not expensive racing bikes, not luxury touring bikes. Cheap, durable, practical bicycles for a Depression-era public that needed transportation they could afford. Schwinn introduced bikes for kids, bikes for workers, bikes that cost less but still carried the Schwinn guarantee. This pivot was brilliant. While luxury manufacturers died, Schwinn survived by serving the people who had no other options. The depression that killed the motorcycle business saved the bicycle business. By the mid-1930s, Schwinn was emerging as one of the largest bicycle manufacturers in America. But Ignaz was getting old. He was in his 70s, still coming to factory every day, still involved in every major decision. His son Frank had been working alongside him since the 1920s, learning the business, learning his father's obsessive attention to manufacturing quality. In 1948, Ignaz Schwinn died at age 88. Frank took over. And what happened next turned Schwinn from a successful company into an American icon. Schwinn Bicycle Company became the #1 bicycle manufacturer in the United States. Not by a small margin, by an enormous one. At its peak in the 1950s and early 1960s, Schwinn controlled approximately 25% of the entire American bicycle market. 1 out of every 4 bikes sold in America was a Schwinn. The factory on North Costner Avenue in Chicago's Hermosa neighborhood ran 6 days a week, producing hundreds of thousands of bicycles a year. By 1968, that factory would produce 1 million bikes in a single year. 1 million. The operation was massive. Sheet metal rolling in one end, finished bicycles rolling out the other. 1,800 workers at peak capacity in the 1970s. Frame builders, welders, painters, assemblers, each one part of a manufacturing machine that had been refined over 50 years. The quality control was obsessive. Frank Schwinn walked the factory floor constantly, inspecting welds, checking paint jobs, testing components. He believed, like his father before him, that the Schwinn name meant something, that when a customer bought a Schwinn, they were buying a promise. This wasn't just marketing. The bikes were genuinely built to last. Heavy, yes. Overbuilt, often, but durable. A Schwinn from the 1950s could survive being ridden hard by 3 generations of kids and still work. The distribution network Frank built was equally impressive. Schwinn didn't just sell bikes. They created an ecosystem. Authorized Schwinn dealers received exclusive territories, protected profit margins, co-op advertising support, and service training. In return, they sold only Schwinn bikes. This vertical control meant Schwinn could maintain prices, control brand image, and ensure that every customer experience was consistent. Walk into a Schwinn dealer in California, and the experience was identical to a dealer in New York. Same display, same service, same quality. The product lineup covered every segment. The Phantom, a heavy cruiser with chrome fenders and white wall tires that became the symbol of 1950s American childhood. The Varsity, introduced in 1960, an affordable 10-speed that would become the best-selling road bike in American history. The Continental, a slightly upgraded version of the Varsity. The Paramount, a hand-built racing bike that competed with European imports and proved Schwinn could build performance machines, not just mass-market cruisers. Schwinn didn't just sell bicycles. They sold American identity. Ads featured kids riding to school, teenagers going to malt shop, families riding together on weekends. The bicycle is freedom. The bicycle is childhood. The bicycle as the American dream on 2 wheels. The brand loyalty was cult-like. Parents who'd ridden Schwinns as kids bought Schwinns for their own children. Dealers stayed loyal for decades. The network held together because everyone was making money. Schwinn was printing profit. The dealers were printing profit. Everyone won. This is the moment when everything worked. The manufacturing was efficient. The distribution was controlled. The brand was untouchable. Schwinn wasn't just the biggest bicycle company in America. It felt invincible. Early 1960s. Southern California. Teenagers were doing something Schwinn never expected. They were taking their Schwinn cruisers, ripping off the fenders, adding chopper-style handlebars they called ape hangers, mounting banana seats, and turning their bikes into miniature motorcycles. They were customizing, creating, building something Schwinn had designed but that carried the Schwinn name. A Schwinn sales executive named Al Fritz saw what was happening and brought the idea back to Chicago. What if Schwinn built this bike? What if instead of waiting for kids to modify bikes, Schwinn gave them what they wanted straight from the factory? In 1963, Schwinn introduced the Stingray, 20-inch wheels, ape-hanger handlebars, long banana seat, rear sissy bar, available in colors with names like flamboyant lime, radiant copper tone, sky blue, violet. It was a motorcycle for kids who couldn't drive. The market went insane. The Stingray didn't just sell. It exploded. Kids across America begged their parents for one. The bike defined cool. You could do wheelies. You could ride with a friend on the back. You could customize it further with accessories Schwinn happily sold. Streamers, bells, mirrors, baskets. By the late 1960s, the Stingray and its variations accounted for more than 60% of Schwinn's juvenile bike sales. Schwinn introduced variations. The Crotty series in the late 1960s with 5-speed transmissions and unique names like the Orange Crotty, Lemon Peeler, Apple Crotty, Pea Picker. Each one sold in massive numbers. Competitors tried to copy the design, but they couldn't match the Schwinn quality or the Schwinn dealer network. The Stingray was more than a product. It was a cultural phenomenon. It appeared in movies, TV shows, every suburban garage. The bike became a symbol of 1960s and 1970s American childhood, as iconic as baseball cards and comic books. Sales numbers went through the roof. Production at the Chicago factory couldn't keep up with demand. Schwinn opened a second facility to handle overflow. The company was making more money than it ever had. Frank Schwinn was still at the helm in the early 1960s when the Stingray launched, though he was aging and would die in 1963. His son, Frank Valentine Schwinn, took over, continuing the family tradition. The company felt unstoppable. The Stingray proved Schwinn could innovate, could capture youth culture, could dominate a market segment completely. This was Schwinn at its absolute peak, the moment when the name alone could sell 1 million bikes, when the factory ran 3 shifts to keep up, when the Schwinn dealer network stretched into every town in America, when owning a Schwinn wasn't just about having a bicycle. It was about belonging to something bigger. The 1970s. America was obsessed with fitness, jogging, aerobics, and bicycles, but not the heavy cruiser Schwinn had been building for decades. Lightweight road bikes, 10 speeds with drop handlebars and narrow tires, bikes that weighed 25 pounds instead of 50. European manufacturers, especially the French and Italians, were importing these bikes in increasing numbers. They were expensive, but they were light, fast, designed for long-distance riding, for racing, for a new generation of cyclists who didn't want to cruise to the corner store. They wanted to ride 50 miles on a Saturday morning. Schwinn noticed the trend. They had their 10-speed models, the Varsity and Continental, which sold in huge numbers. But here's the problem. Those bikes weren't really lightweight. They were built like Schwinn cruisers with drop handlebars bolted on. The frames were heavy. The components were basic. Schwinn used a construction method called electroforged welding, basically stamping and welding steel tubes together, which was cheap and fast but resulted in heavy frames. Schwinn's response to the lightweight trend was to keep building the Varsity and Continental and sell them as 10 speeds. They sold millions of them. The Varsity became the best-selling road bike in America. But they weren't competitive with European bikes. Not even close. Serious cyclists, the ones spending real money, were buying Peugeots, Gitanes, Bianchis, not Schwinn's, except for the Paramount. The Paramount was Schwinn's hand-built racing bike, lug steel, built by a craftsman named Oscar Waston, and later at a dedicated facility in Waterford, Wisconsin. Paramounts were genuinely good bikes, respected by racers, but they were expensive, produced in tiny numbers, and represented less than 1% of Schwinn sales. The mass market, where Schwinn made its money, kept buying Varsities because the Schwinn name meant something. But something was shifting. The cyclists who care about performance, who read magazines and joined clubs, who would later become the influencers of bike culture, those cyclists were looking elsewhere. Schwinn dismissed this. They believed their market was families, kids, casual riders. The serious cyclists were a niche, a tiny segment that didn't matter. This was the first warning sign, and Schwinn ignored it completely. Meanwhile, something else was happening on the West Coast that Schwinn didn't understand. In Marin County, California, a group of cyclists were riding old cruiser bikes down mountain trails, clunking down fire roads at dangerous speeds. They started modifying bikes. Stronger brakes, better tires, wider gear ranges. By the mid-1970s, they were building entirely new bikes designed specifically for off-road riding. Mountain bikes. Gary Fisher, Joe Breeze, Tom Ritchie. These weren't big manufacturers. They were guys in garages, building bikes by hand, learning as they went. By the late 1970s, small companies were forming around these hand-built mountain bikes. The market was tiny, mostly California, mostly enthusiasts, but it was growing. Schwinn heard about it. Dealers reported customers asking about mountain bikes. Schwinn's response? This is a fad, a niche, a West Coast thing that won't go national. Why would anyone want to ride a bike off-road? Bicycles are for roads, for paths, for paved surfaces. Schwinn didn't see mountain biking as the future of cycling. They saw it as a weird hobby for California eccentrics. So they did nothing. No research and development. No prototypes. No market testing. They waited. And while Schwinn waited, companies like Specialized and Trek started selling mountain bikes. Real mountain bikes with the right geometry, the right components, designed by the people who'd invented the sport. By the early 1980s, mountain biking wasn't a fad anymore. It was a movement. And Schwinn wasn't part of it. They'd missed the beginning entirely. The Chicago factory was in crisis. The building itself was old, parts of it dating back to the early 1900s. The equipment was outdated. The assembly lines hadn't been updated in decades. Productivity was declining, costs were rising, and something else was happening. The workers were organizing. For over 100 years, Schwinn had operated with in-house employee committees instead of outside unions. This paternalistic system worked when the company was printing money, and workers felt taken care of. But by the late 1970s, workers saw executives living well while factory wages stagnated. They saw the company importing cheaper bikes from Taiwan, while Chicago workers were being squeezed. In late 1980, the Chicago factory workers voted to affiliate with the United Auto Workers Union. The Schwinn family took this as a betrayal. Both Edward Schwinn Jr., who became president in 1979, and his cousin Frank Valentine Schwinn, felt the workers they treated like family had turned on them. In September 1980, plant assembly workers began a strike for higher pay. 1,400 workers walked off the job. The strike lasted 13 weeks. 3 months of no production, empty assembly lines, orders backed up, dealers screaming for inventory. When the strike finally ended, the damage was done. Not just the lost production. The relationship between management and workers was poisoned. The factory limped back to life. But everyone knew the writing was on the wall. The Chicago factory was too expensive, too old, too troubled to survive. In 1981, Schwinn announced they were closing the Chicago facility and moving production to a new plant in Greenville, Mississippi. Lower labor costs, right-to-work state, a fresh start. 1,800 Chicago workers lost their jobs. The factory that had built millions of Schwinn bicycles over 80 years shut down. Workers who'd spent entire careers building Schwinns walked out for the last time. Some of them cried. The building on North Costner Avenue, where Ignaz Schwinn had poured his life's work, sat empty. The Greenville plant opened in 1982, but it never worked right. The workforce was inexperienced. Quality problems emerged. Production was slower than projected, and the economics didn't make sense anymore because Schwinn had already started doing something that would prove fatal. They were outsourcing production to Asia. Before the Chicago factory closed, before the strike, Schwinn made a decision that seemed smart at the time. They partnered with a Taiwanese manufacturer called Giant Manufacturing to produce lower-end Schwinn bikes for the American market. Giant was hungry for business. They could build bikes for a fraction of the cost of American production. Schwinn would design the bikes, spec the components, control quality, and Giant would manufacture them. This was vertical integration across an ocean. Schwinn thought they were brilliant. They could have cheap bikes to compete with imports while keeping the premium models in America. The partnership worked. At first, Giant built exactly what Schwinn specified. The quality was acceptable. The prices were incredible. Schwinn started importing more and more bikes from Giant. By the mid-1980s, the majority of Schwinn's bikes were coming from Taiwan, not America. But here's what Schwinn didn't see. They were teaching Giant everything. How to build bikes to American standards. How to meet American demand. How the American market worked. Giant was learning, and they were ambitious. In 1986, Schwinn made an even bigger decision. They shifted from Taiwan to China, partnering with the China Bicycle Company to get even cheaper production. This destroyed their relationship with Giant, and Giant didn't cry about it. They started building bikes under their own name. Giant became one of Schwinn's competitors, a competitor Schwinn had trained. By the late 1980s, Schwinn's manufacturing was a mess. The Greenville plant was losing money every year. The overseas production was creating quality control nightmares. Schwinn designed bikes in Chicago, sent specifications to China, received containers full of bicycles, and discovered problems only after the bikes reached dealers. Returns skyrocketed. Customer complaints increased. The Schwinn name that had meant quality for nearly a century was attached to bikes that broke. And here's the deeper problem. Schwinn had lost control. They didn't own the factories. They didn't control the workers. They were just a brand name licensing production to the lowest bidder. Meanwhile, Trek and Specialized, companies that barely existed in the 1970s, were building bikes in America and Taiwan with modern designs, racing quality components, and aggressive marketing. They hired the California mountain bike pioneers as consultants. They sponsored races. They built bikes cyclists actually wanted to ride. And those companies had something Schwinn had lost: passion. Schwinn had become a company run by executives who saw bicycles as products, not as passion. Edward Schwinn Jr. and the management team were business people, not cyclists. The soul of the company had died with Frank Schwinn. What was left was a corporate machine trying to manage declining margins and rising competition by outsourcing everything that had made Schwinn great. The Greenville plant finally closed in 1991, laying off the last 250 American workers. Just a worker turning off the lights and locking the door behind him forever. Edward Schwinn Jr. noticed the problem. The Stingray sales were collapsing. The bike that had defined Schwinn's dominance for 2 decades was obsolete. BMX racing had exploded in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Kids wanted BMX bikes, not Stingrays. Schwinn responded, but late, introducing their own BMX models. They were okay, not great, not competitive with Mongoose or GT or the other BMX specialists. Just okay. But Schwinn had another problem. Their entire product lineup was aging. The mountain bike revolution was taking over. Schwinn finally entered the market in the mid-1980s with models like the Sierra and High Sierra. But they were years behind. The bikes were heavier than competitors. The geometry was wrong. They were designed by people who didn't ride off-road, built by people who'd never seen a mountain trail. The bikes sold because the Schwinn name still meant something. But serious mountain bikers bought Specialized, Trek, Gary Fisher, not Schwinn. So Schwinn did what struggling companies always do. They diversified. If the bicycle business was declining, expand into other markets. Schwinn started pushing their exercise bikes and fitness equipment. The Schwinn Airdyne, introduced in 1980, was actually successful, a stationary bike with moving handlebars and a fan for resistance. Health clubs bought them. Home users bought them. The fitness equipment business generated real revenue through the 1980s. Schwinn also tried selling cycling accessories, clothing, helmets, everything tangentially related to bicycles. They tried reaching new markets, new demographics, new channels. They were in department stores, sporting goods chains, anywhere that would carry the brand. The exclusive dealer network that had made Schwinn dominant started breaking down. Dealers who've been loyal for decades watched Schwinn selling bikes in Sears and Toys R Us at lower prices than the dealers could match. Why stay loyal? The discipline that had built the empire was crumbling. Schwinn was chasing revenue wherever they could find it, losing focus, losing identity. They were no longer the premium American bicycle company. They were a mass-market brand trying to compete with imports on price. Here's the thing about diversification. It works when you dominate your core business and expand from strength. It fails when you're weak in your core and desperately try and find new revenue streams to cover the bleeding. Schwinn was the second kind. Every dollar spent on fitness equipment or accessories was a dollar not spent fixing the bicycle business. Every department store deal was another nail in the dealer network. Every compromise on quality was another crack in the brand. And mediocrity, as it turns out, is just a slower way to fail. By the late 1980s, Schwinn's market share was in free fall. The company that once controlled 25% of American bicycle sales was down to around 5%. Foreign imports, especially from Taiwan and Japan, were flooding the market. Trek and Specialized were eating the high end. Walmart was eating the low end with bikes so cheap they were basically disposable. Schwinn was stuck in the middle, still charging premium prices based on a reputation that no longer matched reality. The company was hemorrhaging cash, taking on debt to cover operations, hoping something would turn around. It didn't. Late 1992, the executives sat in a conference room staring at numbers that told a story they didn't want to hear. Schwinn owed China Bicycle Company $18 million for bikes already shipped but not paid for. They owed Giant through an Asian trading company called Balma another $9 million. Total debt had climbed to $75 million. The company's annual revenue was around $200 million, which sounds substantial until you realize they were losing money on nearly every bike sold. The margins were gone. The pricing power was gone. The brand equity that had once commanded premium prices was gone. Creditors were circling. China Bicycle Company threatened to stop shipments. Without inventory, Schwinn couldn't fulfill orders. Without orders, dealers would abandon the brand completely. The company was caught in a death spiral. On October 8, 1992, Schwinn Bicycle Company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The filing shocked the industry. Schwinn, the company that had survived the 1900s bicycle bust, the Great Depression, 2 world wars, decades of competition, bankrupt. The bankruptcy revealed the full extent of the disaster. The company was worth less than its debts. The brand had value, but the operations were worthless. The Greenville plant had already closed. The Chicago factory was long gone. Manufacturing was entirely outsourced to suppliers who wouldn't ship without payment. The dealer network, once 1,500 strong, had collapsed to fewer than 700, and most of those were carrying competitor brands. Edward Schwinn Jr. blamed the debt the company took on in the 1980s. He blamed foreign competition. He blamed changing markets. What he didn't say was simpler. Schwinn failed because they stopped innovating. They missed the mountain bike revolution entirely. They destroyed their manufacturing capability by outsourcing to partners who became competitors. They abandoned the dealer network that had made them dominant. They chased cheap production and lost quality. They diversified into markets they didn't understand while their core business died. They stopped listening to cyclists and started listening to accountants. The bankruptcy court oversaw the liquidation. In January 1993, Schwinn's remaining assets, primarily the brand name and trademark, were sold to a group led by Zell-Chilmark Capital for $41 million. China Bicycle Company forgave some debt in exchange for equity. The Schwinn family, after 97 years, lost control of the company Ignaz Schwinn had founded. Frank W. Schwinn, great-grandson of Ignaz, tried to maintain some connection to the family legacy by purchasing the Paramount division, which became Waterford Precision Cycles and still builds high-end bikes today. But the mass-market Schwinn brand was gone. The new owners moved everything overseas, licensing the name to various manufacturers. Today, Schwinn bikes are sold at Walmart and Target, built in China, bearing no resemblance to the bikes that made the name famous. The brand has changed ownership multiple times. Current owner is a Dutch conglomerate called Pon Holdings. The bikes are fine. They work, but they're not Schwinn's. Not really. Not in the way that mattered. The collapse took hundreds of people down. The Chicago workers who lost jobs in 1982. The Greenville workers laid off in 1991. The dealers who've been loyal for decades and saw their franchise value evaporate overnight. The customers who grew up on Schwinn's and watched the brand they trusted become just another disposable import. Edward Schwinn Jr. and the family members lost a fortune, estimated at over $1 billion in family wealth accumulated over nearly a century. The bankruptcy court filings showed the company had been insolvent for years, propped up by creditors who hoped for a turnaround that never came. The mountain bike revolution Schwinn ignored, it became the largest segment of the bicycle industry. By the 2000s, mountain bikes accounted for over 60% of bicycle sales in America. The lightweight road bikes Schwinn dismissed as niche, they spawned a cycling renaissance that continues today. The foreign competitors Schwinn underestimated. Giant is now the largest bicycle manufacturer in the world. Trek is the largest American bike company. Specialized dominates the high-performance market. All of them grew large in the space Schwinn abandoned. The lesson here isn't complicated. Your reputation buys you time, but it doesn't buy you forever. Schwinn survived for decades on a name built in the 1950s and 1960s. Customers kept buying Schwinn's in the 1980s because they remembered the quality from the 1960s. But memories fade. New generations don't care what your brand meant to their parents. They care what you're offering them right now. And Schwinn offered them nothing worth buying. The company believed they were too big to fail. They believed the Schwinn name alone would carry them through any crisis. They believed Americans would always choose Schwinn over competitors because of loyalty, because of history, because of tradition. They were catastrophically wrong. The market doesn't care about your legacy. It cares about whether your product is better than what's next to it on the showroom floor. When Schwinn's bikes weren't better, the name meant nothing. Better to dominate one market than be mediocre in 10. Schwinn tried to be everything to everyone in the 1980s. Department stores and bike shops, kids' bikes and racing bikes, exercise equipment and bicycles, American manufacturing and Asian imports. They lost focus, lost identity, and lost the ability to compete in any segment. Trek succeeded by focusing on performance bikes. Specialized succeeded by focusing on the high end. Walmart succeeded by focusing on the cheapest bikes possible. Schwinn tried to compete in all those markets simultaneously and got destroyed in each one. When the market shifts, you need to shift faster. Mountain bikes weren't a fad. Lightweight road bikes weren't a niche. Schwinn saw both trends emerging and dismissed them as temporary, as West Coast eccentricities that would fade. By the time they realized the shifts were permanent, they were years behind competitors who had built expertise, brand recognition, and customer loyalty in those segments. Catching up from that position isn't just difficult, it's nearly impossible. You can't teach your competitor how to beat you and expect to survive. Schwinn gave Giant and China Bicycle Company everything. Manufacturing specifications, quality standards, access to the American market, training on American consumer preferences. They thought they were outsourcing production. What they actually did was create their own replacement. Giant learned from Schwinn, then competed with Schwinn, then outlasted Schwinn. The relationship that was supposed to save money ended up destroying the company. Chicago. Today, if you drive down North Costner Avenue in the Hermosa neighborhood, you can still see the building where Schwinn bicycles were made. The factory at 1856 North Costner Avenue avoided demolition. It's been converted to other uses now. Light industrial. Storage, nothing glamorous. You can still see the bones of it. The high ceilings designed for assembly lines. The loading docks where trucks once picked up thousands of bikes destined for dealers across America. The windows where workers looked out during breaks. Proud to work for the biggest bicycle company in the country. If you didn't know what you were looking at, you'd drive right past. It's just another old factory building in a city full of them. But if you know the story, if you understand what happened inside those walls, the building feels haunted, not by ghosts, by mistakes, by decisions that seemed smart at the time and turned out to be fatal, by the arrogance of thinking a name could outlast the products that built the name. The original Schwinn factory at Lake Street and Peoria Street, where Ignaz started in 1895, is still standing too. It's been converted to residential lofts now, called the Lake Street Lofts. People live there. They probably don't know they're sleeping in the building where one of America's great manufacturing empires was born. The Greenville, Mississippi plant is gone, torn down. The building that was supposed to save Schwinn by cutting costs lasted less than 10 years. The land where it stood is empty now, grass growing over the foundation. No memorial, no historical marker. Nothing to indicate that for a brief moment, that spot produced Schwinn bicycles. The dealer network that once spanned America has vanished. Some shops still carry the Schwinn name, but they're selling the Walmart-grade imports, not the bikes that made Schwinn legendary. The old Schwinn dealers, the ones who sold exclusively Schwinn for decades, most of them switched to Trek or Specialized or Giant in the late 1980s and early 1990s. They survived by abandoning the brand before it collapsed completely. The customers who grew up on Schwinns in the 1960s and 1970s still talk about those bikes with nostalgia. The Stingray, the Varsity, the Phantom, those bikes live in memory as symbols of childhood, of freedom, of simpler times. But nostalgia doesn't pay the bills. Nostalgia doesn't save companies. The Schwinn family mansion on Humboldt Boulevard in Chicago, the stone fortress Ignaz built to demonstrate his success, was demolished in the 1980s. The site is now a parking lot. All the wealth accumulated over nearly a century, all the pride of building an American institution, erased. The warning in the Schwinn collapse is precise. Complacency kills faster than competition. Schwinn didn't die because Trek was better. They died because they stopped trying to be better themselves. They coasted on reputation while the world changed around them. They believed their history would protect them. It didn't. Control your manufacturing or your manufacturers will control you. Schwinn thought outsourcing was a way to cut costs and increase profits. What it actually did was transfer knowledge, capability, and eventually market share to the companies they hired. The companies that kept manufacturing in-house or maintained tight partnerships with aligned incentives survived. Schwinn didn't. Innovation isn't optional. Markets reward companies that lead and punish companies that follow. Schwinn led in the 1950s and 1960s with the Stingray. They followed badly in the 1980s with mountain bikes and lightweight road bikes. The decade of following erased the decades of leading. Culture matters more than capital. Schwinn lost its soul when the last generation that loved bicycles left. The company, the executives who took over saw bikes as products to move, not as machines that represent freedom and childhood and adventure. That loss of passion showed in every decision. Trek and Specialized were founded by cyclists who love bikes. That love showed too. Brand loyalty is earned daily, not stored forever. Every bike Schwinn sold in the 1980s that broke, that disappointed, that failed to match the quality customers expected, burned through years of accumulated goodwill. Eventually, the bank account of brand loyalty ran dry. Schwinn spent a century building it and a decade destroying it. The silent factory on North Costner Avenue sits surrounded by the hum of modern Chicago. Cars pass. People walk by. Nobody looks twice. The building survived, but everything it represented died. Schwinn isn't the first American manufacturing giant to collapse under the weight of foreign competition, short-sighted management, and reluctance to change. They won't be the last. The story repeats across industries. Cars, steel, electronics, textiles, companies that once dominated, that believed their size made them invincible, that treated their legacy as an asset instead of responsibility to maintain. The bicycle that hangs in your garage or leans against your wall, if it says Schwinn, it's probably one of the good ones. Built before the collapse. Heavy, overbuilt, still working after decades. Those bikes outlasted the company that made them. That's the real tragedy. Schwinn knew how to build bikes that lasted forever. They forgot how to build a company that could do the same. All that's left is silence. And if you listen close enough, that silence is screaming a warning. Dominance is temporary. Excellence requires constant effort. The moment you believe you're too big to fail is the moment you've already begun to fall. Schwinn stood at the peak longer than most companies ever reached the summit. But gravity doesn't care about your history. Markets don't honor legacy. Customers don't owe you their loyalty. You earn it every day, or you die. Schwinn stopped earning it, and the factory went dark, a tombstone for an empire that refused to change.